The judge's gavel never made a sound until he sentenced his own brother to hang at dawn. Tomorrow the courtroom smelled of dust and sweat and fear. Judge Samuel Winters sat behind his wooden bench like a mountain that had learned to speak. His black robes hung heavy on his shoulders, heavier than they had ever felt in 20 years of keeping order in Silver Creek. The gavel lay before him, silent as a tombstone. Thomas stood in chains 30 feet away. His younger brother, his only family left in this world. The iron shackles around his wrists caught the afternoon light that slanted through the courthouse windows, throwing small shadows on the floor like broken promises. The jury had spoken, guilty of murder in the first degree. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel had heard those same words spoken about dozens of men over the years. Horse thieves and claim jumpers, and men who settled their differences with bullets instead of words. But he had never heard them spoken about his own blood. Martha Henderson sat in the front row, her face pale as winter snow. Her husband lay 6 feet under the ground because of the man standing before Samuel's bench. Because of Thomas. Her eyes held no anger now, just the hollow look of a woman who had cried all her tears and had none left to give. The townspeople filled every seat behind her, shop owners and ranchers and their wives, all watching Samuel with the quiet attention of people who knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Some had known the Winters brothers since they were boys running barefoot through these same dusty streets. Others had moved here later, drawn by the promise of gold or land, or just a chance to start fresh where nobody knew their mistakes. But they all knew Samuel as their judge, fair and firm and steady as the mountains that ring their valley. A man who measured his words like a miser counted coins, who never let friendship or favors bend the straight line of justice. They trusted him to do what was right, even when what was right would break him in half. Thomas looked up at his brother then. His face was thinner than Samuel remembered, marked by too much whiskey and too many nights sleeping rough. His eyes were the same blue they had always been, though. The same blue as their mother's, before the fever took her, when they were just boys learning what loss meant. "I ain't asking for mercy, Sam," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the silent room like a stone thrown into still water. "I know what I done." Samuel's hands rested flat on the bench before him. They were steady hands, weathered by years of ranch work before the law called to him. Hands that had built fences and delivered calves and held his wife's fingers on her deathbed 5 winters past. Now they trembled like leaves in a storm. The law was clear. Murder carried only one sentence in the territory. Samuel had spoken those words before, had watched other men's faces crumble when he told them they would hang. It was part of the weight he carried, part of the price of keeping civilization alive in a place where it grew wild and fragile as desert flowers. But this was Thomas. Thomas who had taught him to skip stones across Miller's Creek when they were 8 and 10. Thomas who had sat by his bedside when the scarlet fever nearly took him at age 12. Thomas who had stood beside him at their father's grave, the two of them alone in the world except for each other. The courthouse clock ticked like a heartbeat in the silence. Each second stretched long as a mile, heavy as a coffin lid. Samuel could feel every eye in the room fixed on him, waiting. The law waited too, patient and impartial as death itself. "Thomas Winters," Samuel said, and his voice came out steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of the murder of William Henderson." He paused, looking down at the gavel that had never failed him. In 20 years on this bench, it had been his voice. One sharp crack of wood on wood, and justice was served. Order was maintained. The law stood firm against the chaos that always threatened to swallow places like Silver Creek Hole. The gavel lay silent now. "The sentence of this court," Samuel continued, each word falling like dirt on a grave, "is that you be taken from this place to the county jail, and at dawn tomorrow you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead." A sound went through the courtroom like wind through wheat. Sighs and shifting bodies and the soft whisper of people who had held their breath too long. Martha Henderson nodded once, sharp and final. Justice served. Her husband's blood answered for with blood. Thomas stood straighter in his chains. He looked at his brother across the distance that seemed wider than the whole territory between them. "Thank you, Sam," he said, quiet as a prayer, "for doing what was right." The words hit Samuel like a fist to the chest. He reached for his gavel, lifted it 6 inches above the wooden block that had heard its voice echo through this room for 2 decades. His hand stopped there, suspended between duty and blood, between the law that defined him and the love that had made him. The gavel never fell. Samuel set it down without a sound and rose from his seat like an old man rising from his deathbed. The crowd began to file out, their voices a low murmur of satisfaction and sorrow mixed together like dust and rain. Thomas was led away by Sheriff Morrison, his chains clanking with each step. He did not look back. Samuel stood alone behind his bench, watching his brother disappear through the courthouse door like a ghost fading with the light. Outside, the sun was beginning its long slide toward the western mountains. By the time it rose again, Thomas would be dead, and Samuel would be the man who killed him, as surely as if he had tied the rope with his own hands. The weight of justice had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, standing in the empty courtroom where his gavel lay silent as a secret that would never be told. The oil lamp burned low on Samuel's desk, casting shadows that danced like memories across the walls of his study. He sat in his leather chair, the same one his father had used before him, and stared at the bottle of whiskey he had not touched in 3 years. Tonight felt like a good night to break that promise to himself, but he did not reach for it. Instead, he reached for something harder to swallow: the past. Thomas had been 6 years old when he caught his first firefly. Samuel remembered watching his little brother cup the glowing insect in his small hands. His face lit up with wonder brighter than the bug itself. They had been sitting on the porch steps of their father's ranch house, the summer air thick with the smell of sage and the distant sound of cattle settling in for the night. "It's like holding a piece of starlight," Thomas had whispered, afraid to speak too loud and scare the magic away. Samuel had been 8 then, already serious about the world in the way that oldest sons learn to be. But watching Thomas with that firefly, he had remembered what it felt like to believe in magic, even if just for a moment. The lamp flame guttered in the present, pulling Samuel back to his study where the whiskey waited and dawn crept closer like a wolf circling a dying fire. But the memories would not let him go so easy. He saw Thomas at 10, shinning up the old apple tree behind McCready's store with the quick grace of a squirrel. The apples were not ripe yet, still hard and green as river stones, but Thomas had filled his pockets anyway. When old McCready came running with his walking stick raised high, both boys had taken off running, their stolen fruit bouncing in Thomas's pockets like small green promises of sweetness to come. They had eaten those sour apples sitting by Miller's Creek, making faces at the bitter taste, but laughing until their sides hurt. Thomas had declared them the best apples he had ever tasted, and Samuel had agreed, even though they made his mouth pucker like he had been sucking lemons. "We're like them outlaws in the dime novels," Thomas had said, juice running down his chin. "The Winters gang, stealing apples and making our getaway." Samuel had laughed then. Now the memory tasted more bitter than those green apples ever had. The creek had dried up 2 summers ago. McCready had died the winter after that, alone in his store with nobody to catch boys stealing from his trees. The apple tree had been cut down to make room for a new house where a family from back east had settled. Everything from those days was gone now, except for the memories and the choices that had led them to this night. Samuel remembered teaching Thomas to ride their father's old mare, Rosie. She had been gentle as summer rain, patient with the boy who could not quite reach the stirrups, even standing on a wooden crate. Thomas had fallen off 6 times that first day, landing in the dust with a thud that should have discouraged him. But he had gotten back up every time, his face set with the stubborn determination that Samuel had thought was courage then. Now he wondered if it had been the same stubborn streak that led Thomas down darker paths. The same refusal to give up that had made him keep reaching for the cards when he was losing, keep reaching for the bottle when it stopped helping, keep reaching for easy money when honest work felt too hard. When had it started to change? Samuel could not point to a single moment when his brother had turned from the boy who caught fireflies to the man who stood in chains today. It had been slow, like erosion wearing away a riverbank. A drink here, a bet there, a corner cut when nobody was looking. Their father had tried to talk sense into Thomas when he was 15 and already showing signs of the man he would become. Samuel remembered standing in the barn, pitching hay while their father's voice carried from the house, patient at first, then firm, then angry, then sad. "A man's word is all he's got out here," their father had said. "You break that, and you got nothing left worth having." Thomas had listened with the same polite attention he gave to Sunday sermons, nodding at all the right places. But Samuel had seen something in his brother's eyes even then, a distance that had not been there when they were boys sharing stolen apples. Like Thomas was already planning his escape from the weight of being good. The frontier was hard on boys like Thomas. Boys who wanted life to be bigger and brighter and easier than it was willing to be. The gold rushes promised riches to anyone brave enough to chase them. The saloons promised forgetfulness to anyone with coin in their pocket. The card games promised that luck might change a man's whole life with the turn of a single card. Samuel had chosen different promises. The promise of law and order. The promise of justice served fair and square. The promise of being the kind of man people could count on when everything else fell apart. But in choosing those promises, he had stopped reaching for his brother. He had let duty come between them like dust blown by a hard wind. When Thomas needed someone to pull him back from the edge, Samuel had been too busy being a judge to remember how to be a brother. The lamp burned lower, and Samuel could hear the town settling into sleep around him. Tomorrow would bring the gallows and the rope and the end of Thomas Winters. Tonight was all that remained for remembering the boy who had believed fireflies were pieces of starlight. Somewhere across town, in the jail cell that Sheriff Morrison kept clean as a church pew, Thomas was probably lying on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling and thinking his own thoughts about the road that had led him here. Did he remember the apples? Did he remember learning to ride Rosie? Or had those memories been buried under too many bottles and too many bad choices? Samuel closed his eyes and saw his brother's face as it had been at 6 years old, lit up with wonder at the simple magic of a summer evening. That boy was still in there somewhere, locked away behind the bars of bad decisions and worse luck. But tomorrow would silence him forever, along with the man he had become. The weight of all those lost years pressed down on Samuel's shoulders like a coat made of lead. He had been so busy being the judge that he had forgotten how to be the brother who might have made a difference when it mattered most. Outside his window, the first pale hint of dawn was still hours away, but Samuel could feel it coming like a funeral march played too slow to hear. The rope hung from the gallows like a question mark against the star-filled sky. Samuel could see it through his study window, black as sin against the pale wood of the scaffold that Carpenter Jenkins had built with the careful attention he gave to all his work. Even the instrument of death deserved to be made right in Silver Creek. The clock on Samuel's mantel ticked away the minutes past midnight. Each sound was sharp as a nail being driven into wood. He had not moved from his chair in hours, had not touched the whiskey bottle that sat open beside his cold coffee cup. The lamp burned steady, casting a shadow long across the floor like a man already stretched for hanging. Across town, in the jail cell that smelled of lye soap and regret, Thomas sat at the small wooden table Sheriff Morrison had brought him. A piece of paper lay before him, clean as fresh snow. The pencil stub in his hand was worn down to almost nothing, but the words would not come anyway. Would a man write to nobody at all? What did a condemned soul say to the world he was about to leave behind? Thomas had started the letter a dozen times. Dear Sam, he had written once, then scratched it out. His brother did not need more weight added to shoulders already bent with the burden of tomorrow. To whoever finds this, he had tried next, but that felt like talking to strangers about things too personal for unknown eyes. The truth was, there was nobody left to write to, no wife to beg forgiveness from, no children to leave advice for, no friends who had not already turned their backs when the drinking got bad and the gambling got worse. Just his brother, who had done his duty despite the cost, in a town that would sleep better when Thomas Winters was nothing but a memory. So the paper stayed mostly empty, marked only with false starts and the water stain from where sweat had dropped from his forehead. Thomas had never been good with words anyway. That had been Samuel's gift, even as boys. Samuel could talk their way out of trouble when they got caught stealing apples or skipping church. Thomas had been the one who climbed the tree, but Samuel had been the one who made it sound like they were doing MacReady a favor by pruning his branches. The jail cell felt smaller as the night wore on. Thomas could take 6 steps from the bars to the back wall, 4 steps from one side to the other. He had counted them so many times since his sentencing that the numbers lived in his bones now. 6 and 4. 6 and 4. Like a dance a man learned when he had nowhere else to go. Through the small window, set high in the wall, he could see the same stars Samuel was looking at from his study window. The same sky that had watched over their childhood, over all the choices that had led to this night. Thomas wondered if the stars cared about the small dramas of men, or if they just kept burning because that was what stars did, indifferent as eternity to the brief lives flickering below. In the houses scattered through Silver Creek, people lay in their beds and tried to find sleep that would not come easy. They had all seen hangings before. It was part of frontier justice, necessary as rain and just as natural. But this felt different. This was one of their own, a boy they had watched grow up in their streets, now waiting for dawn to take his last breath. Martha Henderson slept deep and dreamless for the first time since her husband's death. Justice would be served in the morning, and that knowledge settled over her like a blanket she had been cold without. Her husband could rest now. The books would be balanced. But Mayor Thompson lay awake, staring at his ceiling and remembering Thomas as a boy, always quick with a smile and quicker to help when someone needed an extra pair of hands during harvest time. When had that boy turned into a killer? How did the seeds of violence grow in soil that had seemed so ordinary? Dr. Clemens sat by his kitchen table, reading the same page of scripture for the 3rd time without taking in a single word. He would be called to confirm the death in the morning, to make it official for the law books. It was his job, but that did not make it easier. He had delivered Thomas into the world 32 years ago, had stitched up his cuts, and set his broken arm when he fell from Rosie at age 9. Now he would be the one to declare that same boy dead. The night stretched on like a river running uphill. Time moved different when death was waiting at the end of it. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. Samuel found himself checking the clock every few minutes, amazed that so little time had passed while feeling like he had aged years in his chair. He thought about walking to the jail. Sheriff Morrison would let him in, would give the brothers a few minutes alone before dawn came to separate them forever. But what would they say to each other? What words existed for this kind of goodbye? "I'm sorry" seemed too small for the canyon that had opened between them. "I love you" felt too late by 20 years. "Forgive me" could mean too many things. Forgive me for sentencing you. Forgive me for not saving you. Forgive me for being the brother who lived while you learned how to die. Thomas had given up on the letter. The paper lay before him, marked with nothing but his name written in the careful script their schoolteacher had beaten into them with a hickory switch. Thomas Andrew Winters, it said, like a signature on a document no one would ever file. He folded the empty letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket, next to the small silver compass their father had given him on his 16th birthday. The compass needle still pointed north, even here in this cell where directions did not matter anymore. Something stayed true no matter how lost a man got. The stars began to fade as the sky lightened from black to deep blue. Dawn was still an hour away, but the night was losing its grip on the world. Soon Sheriff Morrison would come with the preacher and the keys. Soon the town would gather in the square to watch justice take its course. Samuel stood finally, his joints stiff from sitting so long in the same position. He walked to the window and pressed his palm against the cool glass. The rope hung steady in the morning air, waiting. It had been measured and tested, waited to ensure a clean break. Even in death, Silver Creek did things proper. The gallows creaked softly in the breeze that always came before sunrise, speaking in a voice too quiet for anyone to hear. But both brothers heard it anyway, each in his own place of waiting. The sound of dawn approaching, inevitable as the tide, patient as judgment, final as the last breath a man would ever draw. The longest night was almost over. The hardest day was about to begin. The sun climbed over the eastern mountains like a slow fire, painting the town square gold and orange and the color of old blood. The gallows stood in the center of it all, casting a shadow that stretched toward the courthouse like a pointing finger. People gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices that carried the weight of what they had come to witness. Shop owners stood beside their wives. Ranch hands shifted their weight from boot to boot, uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes. Children pressed close to their mothers, sensing something solemn in the air, even if they did not understand what death meant. Sheriff Morrison walked across the square, with keys jangling at his belt. His face was set like stone, but Samuel could see the tremor in his hands as he unlocked the jail door. Morrison had known Thomas since they were boys too, had played marbles with him behind the schoolhouse, and shared his lunch when Thomas forgot to bring his own. Samuel stood on the courthouse steps, watching his town prepare to watch his brother die. He wore his black judicial robes, but they felt heavier than lead, heavier than all the years he had worn them in service to the law. His hands hung empty at his sides. The gavel remained on his bench inside, silent as a secret. The door to the jail opened. Thomas walked out between Sheriff Morrison and Deputy Hayes, his hands bound behind his back. He had washed his face and combed his hair as best he could. Someone had given him a clean shirt. He looked almost like the boy Samuel remembered, if you ignored the chains and the shadow of the gallows falling across his face. Thomas looked up at the courthouse steps and found his brother's eyes. The distance between them was only 50 yards, but it might as well have been the width of the whole territory. 20 years of choices stood between them, like a canyon too wide to cross. Preacher Williams stepped forward, his Bible clutched in hands that shook worse than autumn leaves. He was old, older than anyone else in Silver Creek, and he had seen more hangings than he cared to count. But his voice still carried strong when he spoke. "Do you have any last words, Thomas Winters?" The crowd grew quiet as church on Christmas morning. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Thomas looked around at the faces he had known all his life. Some watched with satisfaction, others with sorrow, most with the careful attention people gave to things they needed to remember later. "I done wrong," Thomas said, his voice carrying clear across the square. "I killed a good man for money that wasn't mine to take. I ain't asking for forgiveness from nobody, because some things can't be forgiven. But I want to say this much. My brother Samuel is the finest man Silver Creek ever had. Don't let what I done change how you think of him." Martha Henderson stood near the front of the crowd, her black dress making her look like a shadow cast by grief. She nodded once when Thomas finished speaking, a small gesture that might have been acceptance or might have been goodbye. Sheriff Morrison began to lead Thomas toward the gallows steps. Each footfall sounded loud as gunshots in the morning air. The rope waited, tied in 13 careful coils the way the law required. The trapdoor had been tested twice to make sure it would open clean. Samuel felt something crack inside his chest, like ice breaking on a frozen pond. He watched his brother climb those steps with the same steady courage he had shown as a boy falling off Rosie and getting back up every time. This was different, though. This time, there would be no getting back up. The noose went around Thomas's neck like a necklace made of hemp and death. Sheriff Morrison's hands shook as he tightened it, positioning the knot behind Thomas's left ear the way the manual said to do it. Quick and clean, that was the promise. A broken neck instead of slow strangle. "Any final words?" Sheriff Morrison asked, though his voice was barely loud enough to hear. Thomas looked out over the crowd one more time, then raised his eyes to the courthouse steps where his brother stood frozen like a statue carved from regret. "I love you, Sam," he called out. "I'm sorry I never learned how to be the brother you deserved." The words hit Samuel like bullets. He felt his knees wobble, felt 20 years of being a judge crack and fall away like old paint peeling from a weathered fence. What was the law compared to this? What was justice compared to watching your only family die while you stood by and let it happen? Sheriff Morrison reached for the lever that would open the trapdoor. His hand stopped there, waiting for some signal that it was time. The crowd held its breath. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to the small drama playing out in its light. Samuel's feet moved without him telling them to. He walked down the courthouse steps, across the dusty square, through the crowd that parted before him like water before the prow of a boat. He climbed the gallows steps, his black robes billowing around him like the wings of some dark angel. "Stop," he said, and his voice carried the authority of 20 years on the bench. Sheriff Morrison's hand froze on the lever. Samuel stood beside his brother, close enough to see the tears Thomas was trying not to shed, close enough to smell the fierce sweat and the soap he had used to wash his face, close enough to remember what it felt like to love someone more than duty, more than law, more than the good opinion of a town that would judge them both for what happened next. "I sentence you," Samuel said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square, "to life in the territorial prison. 20 years hard labor, with no possibility of parole." The crowd erupted like a disturbed beehive. Voices raised in confusion and anger. Martha Henderson's face went white as winter snow. Sheriff Morrison stared at Samuel like he had lost his mind. "You can't do that," Morrison said. "The law says I know what the law says," Samuel replied, reaching up to loosen the noose around his brother's neck. "But the law also says a judge has the right to commute a death sentence to life imprisonment when circumstances warrant mercy. I am exercising that right." Thomas looked at his brother with eyes full of wonder and tears. "Sam, you can't. They'll run you out of town. They'll take your judgeship away." Samuel smiled for the first time in days, a sad smile that held 20 years of distance and regret and love that had never died, not even under the weight of duty and disappointment. "Let them," he said. "I've been a judge for 20 years. It's time I remembered how to be a brother." The sun climbed higher over Silver Creek, painting the gallows and the crowd, and the two brothers standing together in light that looked almost like forgiveness. The rope hung empty now, swaying gently in the morning breeze. The gavel had finally spoken, but not with the harsh crack of wood on wood that everyone expected. Instead, it had spoken with the quiet voice of mercy, as soft as a whisper between brothers who had found their way back to each other when it mattered most.